I will introduce you in bahasa, if it's okay. So, Carolyn adalah seseorang yang memulai karirnya di tahun 94. Jadi dia salah satu pendiri penyedia layanan internet, di mana salah satu klien pertamanya adalah sebuah surat kabar lokal. Dan dari situ perusahaan Carolyn menciptakan sebuah situs web yang membuat berita itu diubah menjadi HTML. Nah, setelah itu dia menjalankan situs berita punya dia sendiri, dan ini merupakan salah satu situs berita yang disertakan dalam program Google News, dan dia juga sudah menghabiskan 7 tahun bekerja untuk sebuah penerbitan bernama Tribune sebagai Director of Search, dan juga surat kabar termasuk Chicago Tribune, kemudian LA Times, and also New York Daily. And dia juga sudah menghabiskan 3 tahun di Disney sebagai lead SEO di jaringan domestik dan global. Dan saat ini Carolyn bekerja dengan Dawn Petrol LLC. So I think that's the short explanation to introduce you to our audience. Hari ini semua webinar akan dalam bahasa Inggris, tapi yang mungkin kurang bahasa Inggrisnya, semua pertanyaan bisa ditaruh di kolom chat. Jadi pertanyaannya tidak akan langsung, tapi Carolyn ingin juga lihat nih, kalau misalkan bahasa Inggrisnya kurang bisa langsung di kolom chat aja, kalau enggak nanti saya bantu translate. So the time is yours now.
Time's mine? Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining so late at night. I appreciate the accommodation of the time difference. The presentation is obviously in English. If there's things that we need to go back over, just let me know and I'll try to explain them as best I can. Some of these examples are very specific to events that happened in America. So they're being presented as analogies and examples. And then the other thing that I wanted to just preface with is that news SEO, the algorithm that runs Google News and how stories are chosen for those special carousels is different than your standard regular universal algorithm. So these would be, this is guidance that we give to the newsrooms specific to having stories on your site that are classified as news appear in either Google News or in those special carousels for certain certain queries. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. That's not it. Hold on. Wait, unshare. That wasn't it. That's still not it. How do I get out? Stop share. Sorry. Okay, let's try this again.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
Said screen two. Says screen two. All right, let's try this again. So what do we see? We don't see what, do you see the newsroom SEO?
Yes.
Yes.
Excellent. Okay. All right, so we'll start the slideshow. Maybe from the beginning. Do you still see the newsroom SEO?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, awesome, cool. All right, so here we go. Core concepts we're going to talk about. Determining the keywords in your keyword phrases, writing your headlines, the lead paragraph, which is the first paragraph that starts your news story, the SEO description, quantity versus quality, and then some reminders about images and videos. So for the keywords, with news, there isn't as much keyword research to do because news is the news. It's what's happening, and the topic of your story generally dictates what the keywords are. That being said, there are times when the keywords that would be official or appropriate according to the style guide or according to your company's best practices aren't necessarily the keywords that people are going to search for. So knowing the difference between the words that are stylistically correct versus what everyone's going to search for is important. So when you have cases like this, how do you make a decision? Google Trends is a great tool for this. So the example that I used here was I searched for the differences between coronavirus and COVID. I isolated it to Indonesia. I looked at the past 5 years so that we could see the entire trend of the pandemic. And I looked specifically at news search. So what we see here is that in the beginning of the pandemic, everyone searched for coronavirus because we didn't really call it COVID. And the people that were calling it COVID, I don't know if it just wasn't catching on or what the problem was, but in the beginning, everyone searched for coronavirus. There was a point at which, though, that changed and COVID took over as being the preferred variant of that keyword phrase. And this happens with a lot of things and a lot of terms. At ESPN for basketball, during March Madness is the springtime college basketball tournament. It's a very big tournament. Everyone goes crazy, big deal. So we look at what are people searching for related to the tournament. People generally look for March Madness or the tournament for the first 3 weeks of the tournament, but there's a point at which people stop caring about the tournament in general and they start getting really interested in the Final Four. So we look at Google Trends to see exactly where that crossover point is, so we know when to stop referencing the tournament itself and start focusing very hard on Final Four. We also check for how are people looking for the Super Bowl. One of the things that we were able to identify with Google Trends was how Americans in particular deal with Roman numerals. So the Super Bowl has a tendency to be like Super Bowl XX, which is Super Bowl 20. Americans are not real good with long Roman numerals. So everyone, based on Google Trends, we knew that we had to switch to using real numbers instead of the Roman numerals, even though that was stylistically appropriate, because people didn't understand how to search for that. So Google Trends is a great tool for isolating those crossover points and comparing. I think you can compare up to 5 different search variants to see which one is going to get you the most traction. When you isolate by country, you can also see various subregions. So in this case, we can see based on region what the difference is between searching for COVID versus searching for coronavirus, which is helpful if you have perhaps a locally targeted area or you're trying to target a specific area. Using the words that people are going to search for is obviously going to help you in search. So when you're writing, Google News specifically prefers an inverted pyramid style news story. And I have an example of an inverted pyramid later on, which is a great screenshot to use because it shows you the pyramid and it shows you what Google likes to see in which part of the pyramid. The inverted pyramid is basically everything that's very important is up at the top. The bulk of the story is below that. And then at the bottom are, I wouldn't say necessarily extraneous details, but things that maybe aren't as vital to the story. So the bulk of the really important information needs to be right at the top, right underneath the headline. As you're writing, using the words that people are most likely to be searching for is going to be helpful. You can't, here's a good example. The LA Times wrote an obituary for Leonard Nimoy, who you may know played Spock in the original Star Trek series. When Leonard Nimoy died, the headline for that obituary said, "TV's beloved Spock dies." And then in the first paragraph, they did not mention him by name or the fact that he was dead until I think more than 1,000 words into the article. Google did not realize that that was an obituary for Leonard Nimoy. Even though people might immediately associate Spock with Leonard Nimoy, you have to say the name of the thing that you want to be found for in order for people to find you and in order for Google to know what it is you're writing about. Because the news algorithm is, I would say, a little bit more literal than the universal algorithm. It doesn't spend as much time trying to figure out what exactly you're talking about. So being funny or clever or using puns might be appealing to a reader, but it's not going to tell the search engine what your story is about, and it might cause some confusion. So making sure that you're using the preferred variant in the headline and the lead is super important. You also have to think about who's likely to be interested in your story. In the US, we have, because we're so broad and so big, we have a lot of differences between how things are searched for when they're of national interest versus how things are searched for when they're of local interest. So not over localizing the headline when you're trying to reach a national audience is important. For example, if someone does something stupid in Florida, you wouldn't want to say, Orlando man does something stupid. You would say Florida man does something stupid, because everybody recognizes that when something happens in Florida, it's going to be crazy. But if you over localize it to the city, you're going to lose that keyword grab. So this is a story that was of national interest, but it was a very local story. Normally, AP style guides and newspaper style guides would want you to only reference the person in the story by their official real name and to only say their whole name once and then reference them by last name in subsequent mentions. Except the problem is this guy had a very difficult to spell last name, like literally impossible for anyone to spell this correctly on the first try. So what a lot of organizations ended up doing, because it was so much easier to associate him with his nickname, which was G.I. Joe, newspapers that did well in search incorporated his nickname into all of their search collateral, because they knew people could spell G.I. Joe, but they couldn't spell Joe Glasinowitz. So the highlighted name here is his actual last name, which, again, it's very difficult to spell if you're not familiar with, if you didn't already know how to spell it, you would not be able to guess. And the problem we had is that when you use Google, Google suggests all these other G names. And again, you have to know exactly how it's pronounced and exactly how to spell it if you're going to guess the correct name. So instead of using his real name, most of the coverage that got good traction used his nickname. So when you put in G.I. Joe police officer, G.I. Joe cop, those were the phrases that ranked in Google News. And the way we checked this was we just started typing it into Google, and Google Suggest filled in the blanks because Google knows what people are searching for. This particular article, which was by the Daily Beast, did a great job combining all of the search terms in a way that was still acceptable to the editorial board at the newspaper, but kind of wedged in all of those terms that they know people are searching for in Google. So in this case, they prefaced it with that he was a police officer, which normally wouldn't make it into the story. They've got his nickname, so they've got cop, which we know is part of the search term. They've got G.I. Joe, which is part of the search term. The keyword phrase that we're going for that Google said we needed to target was G.I. Joe cop or G.I. Joe police officer. They have it literally the first thing in the headline. They do include his real last name because that's important for news to be accurate. They have police again, and then they have murder. All of these things that they highlighted are things that maybe they're not over localizing, but they're still including all of the relative information. This is just a really good example of how to work in all of the keywords that you need to do while still writing a good news story. So moving on to headlines. When your headline, which is your H1 usually, and also ends up being the title of the meta title of the page, headlines are generally written tightly. And when we say tight, I'm not sure how this is in other countries, but I suspect it's similar. In the US, there's a rhythm and a style to writing newspaper headlines because it used to cost money per character to write a headline. So the shorter your headline, the cheaper it was to run in the newspaper. So we got in this habit of leaving out words that didn't matter, like the, a, and, sometimes verbs. A lot of connector words get left out. So there would be a comma instead of 2 spaces and 3 letters for and. So we call that writing tightly. We're leaving out filler words and just keeping the words that really have meaning so that we can focus. We're focusing on the keywords. And this was, early 20th century keyword optimization. We know that shorter headlines tend to perform better, but that doesn't mean that we should ever sacrifice necessary detail just to keep it short. And I have some examples of headlines that are unnecessarily short later. There's a phrase that we use called not burying the lead. Not burying the lead means you don't spend 10 minutes talking about something and then the really exciting thing that people should be really interested in, you just sort of mention later. That's burying the lead. The lead is meant to be the first thing that you read. Google News, the robot, is trained to find the headline, which is the H1, and then the first big block of text it encounters, it assumes is the lead paragraph. So it's comparing what's in the headline to what's in that lead paragraph to determine relevancy and importance. Having the target keyword phrase, the thing that you want the reader to know, be first in that headline and then first in that lead paragraph is really important to performing well in Google News. Also, when you're writing your headlines, you have to remember that there's no surrounding context. When newspapers, were still on paper, people they'd pick up the newspaper, they'd know that it was the Kansas City Chronicle, and they would be standing in Kansas City, and everything they knew contextually around them was related to Kansas City. So if you said the mayor, the reader knew you were talking about the mayor of Kansas City because you were in Kansas City. You were standing there, you knew that. But on the internet, everything exists in a vacuum. So when you say the mayor or the president or the dog catcher, you don't know which one because there's a lot of them in the world and it could be anyone. So being very clear in terms of what you're talking about specifically, being unambiguous, I think would be the best word to use. So these are some examples. The first example is obviously a bad headline. The president will be visiting us next week, exclamation point. From a journalism perspective, we do not use exclamation points in our headlines or in our writing because that is editorializing and we do not do that. So that's bad right there. But when you say the president, I don't know which president. I don't know the president of what. Will be visiting. Okay, that's acceptable, but us, who's us? Is us my company? Is us my house? Is us my country in general? What is us? And when is next week? All of these things are relative, so we're not really being specific enough to get search traction. President to visit next week is a little bit better because we've gotten rid of some of the fluff words that aren't necessary. It's a much tighter headline. President to visit means the same thing as will be visiting, but is obviously much shorter. Next week is still next week. It's not specific enough. So let's try Acme Corp welcomes President Obama June 2nd. So now we know who's being visited, which president we're talking about, and the date. Much, much better. The problem is, technically, you should have the most important thing lead the headline, right? So in general, just in social circles, when you're introducing people, you introduce the people to the most important person first. So if I'm introducing you and the Queen of England, I would address the Queen of England and introduce that person to her because she's more important, if that makes sense. In the case of search, President Obama guaranteed has higher search volume than Acme Corporation. So we want to lead with President Obama because he's more important. He's going to have the higher search volume. He's the most important person. Acme Corp is important, but it's not the most important. So President Obama, what's he doing? He's visiting. Where's he visiting? Acme Corp. What date? June 2nd. Short, sweet, to the point, but includes all of the very important information in a very specific order, which is highest search volume, most important, to least important. We want to front load all of the important information. So good for print, as I mentioned before, university settles dispute with city. I don't know which university though, I don't know what the dispute's about, and I don't even know what city they're talking about. So while it's good for print, it's not good for the internet. Better for the internet. Purdue University settles dispute with West Lafayette. It's good, but I don't know what the dispute's about, and the dispute could be pretty important. Purdue settles excise enforcement dispute with local government. This is actually really good for online because I know what the university is, which also tells me what the contextual setting is. Excise enforcement dispute is very specific, so it's not ambiguous. It gives a lot of really quick information about the specifics of the dispute. Local government, that's fine. I don't have to specify West Lafayette because I already said Purdue University, which is in West Lafayette. So Google knows the locality of Purdue University, which means Google can extrapolate what the local government is. Even though this is a longer headline, this provides a lot more detailed information quickly. All right, let's move on to the lead. Again, the lead is that first paragraph, that first chunk of content right after the headline. And that's how, I'm getting a ton of phone calls. That's how Google is going to evaluate your story. So your headline lead agreement, the first sentence, that first paragraph needs to reinforce and echo what's in the headline. The headline is like a promise, and that lead needs to deliver on the promise. When you've got a discrepancy between what's in the headline and what's in that first paragraph, you're not going to perform as well. And it could actually knock you out of the cluster of news stories that you want to appear with. We had a situation in Chicago where our headline was, and I'm not going to use the name of the hockey player because this involved a rape case and I don't want to say the wrong hockey player and I can't remember which one it was. So let's call him Bob Smith. It said, Smith returns to training camp, Blackhawks say. And this was almost an identical headline to what the competing newspaper in town ran. The difference was our first paragraph started out with all the other things they talked about at the press conference. And then the last sentence of that first paragraph was, and Bob Smith has been announced to be returning to training camp. The paper across the river, exact same headline almost. Their first sentence was, at the press conference yesterday, the Blackhawks announced that Bob Smith would be returning to training camp. And then they talked about all the other things that got mentioned at the press conference. So the headline matching that the beginning of the first paragraph is really important for context. The newspaper across the river, which normally does not beat the Tribune in the clusters, kicked our butt for that story. And it was because that one sentence was at the end instead of at the front like it should have been. So making sure that you keep all of those things together is going to improve your relevancy score. There are certain types of news stories where people are inclined to have a delayed ID of the lead. You know, that Leonard Nimoy obituary is a good example where it's more literary, it's more poetic, it's more artful to talk about his life story and then do the delayed and now he's dead. But that's not good for Google News. So there are times and places to exercise your skill as a writer. And then there's times and places to be a journalist and keep everything at the top. So if you're trying to do well in Google News, keeping everything close to the top is the best strategy. So Google News is looking for objective news, so not necessarily deep opinion pieces, but objective reporting type of news to they're looking for that for their news clusters. They're just trying to convey information. They're not necessarily trying to tell you how to think. Google is looking to extract information out of that first paragraph to use as a teaser for your story in the search results. They're not necessarily going to take that meta description, which is what we're accustomed to be in the search results. For news, they're literally going to take the first chunk of text that they encounter. If that first chunk of text happens to be an image caption, which happens when you put your image at the top, so you have that hero image and then there's a caption. If the hero image and the caption is between the headline and the start of the story, 9 times out of 10, that caption is going to be mistaken for the beginning of the content. And that's what's going to get grabbed. So it's important that you make sure that Google can locate and identify clearly what is the headline and what is the actual content, and then write that first paragraph, assuming that Google's going to take that and use that as your meta description, because they do most of the time. This is also why it's important to front load all of the important information and the keywords as close to the fronts of the sentences and as close to the top of the article as you can, because again, they're looking to grab that off the page and reuse it. This is that inverted pyramid I was telling you about. All of the vital details that are part of your story, like, again, back to print, because this all really goes back to print. We wrote stories in column inches, so they were long, and it costs money. The longer your story was, the more it costs to print. So editors would selectively chop off the bottoms of your stories to make them fit in the space that they had, which is why we wrote in an inverted pyramid, because it wouldn't matter as much if they cut off the last 2 inches of your story, because all the important information is at the top. If the important information is at the bottom and they start chopping, you're going to lose important details. So everyone was trained to write with the important stuff at the top. Obviously, that's not an issue in the digital age, but because Google had to do something to train the robots, the AI, to identify certain types of content, they trained it like we used to train writers in journalism school, because that was the easiest way to train them. So that's why the robots think the way they do. That being said, this is the thing that they're looking for. They're looking for the vital details and the information up top, the bulk of the story in a logical flow in the middle, and then extraneous detail that it won't change the meaning of your story if it gets cut off or truncated at the very bottom. So the SEO description, this would be, the meta description. First, assume Google is going to take your lead paragraph. Assume Google doesn't care about the SEO description for news. That being said, most content management systems like WordPress will take the first 200 characters of your story and use that as the meta description, which is great if you're writing standard inverted pyramid style straight news stories. If you have a delayed identification lead, where in the newsroom they call it the nut graph, which I think means the meat of the story, the paragraph that is the meat of the story. If that's lower than the first paragraph, I would highlight that and paste that into the SEO description or meta description box, just to be on the safe side, but don't assume Google will find it. This is just in case. Your meta description obviously should be around the size of a tweet. That's a fair thing to do. And don't just repeat the headline. You want to have the same information that's in the headline, but expand upon it a little bit, which is, I think, fairly standard guidance for all SEO. So let's talk relatively quickly about quantity and quality. The minimum for inclusion in Google News is 180 words. They don't always just count what's in the story. Sometimes they count the surrounding navigation captions, things like that, but they don't always. So if for some reason Google thinks your story does not meet the 180 word minimum for inclusion, they just simply will not include that story in Google News. Doesn't mean you won't be included in regular search. It just means that you won't have the opportunity to be in that special cluster at the top, or in the carousel, or in Google News. So if you are relying on Google News, you have to make sure that you hit that minimum word count. Sometimes Google thinks an article is ended when it sees a large embed. And I think I actually have 2 slides on this. Those large embeds, like an image that goes side to side, or if you embed a tweet, if you embed a video, a YouTube video, anything that is going to cause a large break in the story, the robots they're not foolproof. Sometimes they hit those embeds and they go, oh, the story's ended. All done. And they stop counting. And if you haven't hit your minimum for inclusion, they just go, oh, this story doesn't count. And you've lost your chance for that story to be included. So do try to make sure that you have a meaty 1 or 2 paragraphs before you do anything really big and crazy that interrupts the flow of your article. Also, make sure that you're using the words that you're trying to rank for. Writing out the full name of important things on first mention is still really important. One of the things, and this is a sports related anecdote, we have, including in the site I work on now, we have writers that write for like fantasy sports. And all they ever write about is fantasy sports, fantasy baseball, let's say. They will not say fantasy baseball ever in their story. Well, our readers know that that's what they're reading. Like, yes, I know your readers know that's what they're reading, but Google doesn't know that that's what they're reading. So for the love of all that is holy, please say fantasy baseball if you would like to rank for fantasy baseball. Just say it once, say it in the lead. Just introduce it as today's fantasy baseball analysis or something, but please say it once. If you want to rank for it, you have to say it at least once. And then the other thing is don't add too many links. Links need to be, well, here. Ask yourself these questions about the links. They need to be relevant. Are you adding it for the benefit of the user, or are you adding it because someone asked you to? Or are you adding it to send Google juice to somebody's business? Sending value to someone's business is fine if the business's appearance is relevant to the story. Any link you add should add value for your reader. Otherwise, it's not necessary. Adding links to help the reader understand or get more information about a topic, that's great. Linking them over to more stories about a certain person, that's great. Just linking out to, let someone buy a widget that you briefly mentioned, maybe not necessarily the appropriate thing to do. The other thing to look at is how many links do you have on the page how many links do you have in general? Are you peppering your story with links? That's going to look suspicious and maybe like low quality. Do you have a lot of links that go to the same destination page? Not only does that look suspicious, but it's unnecessary. Google only counts the first link to a given destination. So by adding all of those extra links, you're just diluting the value that you're passing anyway. It's not necessary. So 1 link per destination, and make sure that link is relevant and valuable to the user. When we talk about the total amount of links that you have, we need to talk about a sufficient quantity of copy. You don't need to read all this. I literally just copied this out of Wikipedia. This is the first 3 paragraphs from the Wikipedia entry on apples. This is about, I think, 500 words of copy. But that was 280. So after I took out all the stop words, which are words that don't count, I'm down to 165 words. So making sure that you're writing quality and not just filling up sentences with fluff is also very important to determining contextual relevancy. Writing more than the bare minimum to get you included is great, but writing too much is also bad. So making sure that you have enough words after all the stop words are removed is going to make sure that the engines have enough to chew on when they're processing your story. If you need a list of the words that are going to be removed, they're old links, but they're still valid. These are English words that don't count, basically. The quality of the words that you use is also very important. So if you tell your story well, don't add more just to have more. Tell the story well, tell the story concisely, but make sure that you meet the minimum. That's really all we can ask for news. There's no such thing as 1,000 words is going to rank better than 500 words. Tell the story in as many words as you need to tell the story well, because the quality of your story is the most important. This is back to the embeds, because I forgot that I already mentioned it. Just do make sure, it's super important. And this was a problem that I've had at every single publication. LA Times had this problem, Chicago Tribune had this problem, we had this problem in ESPN. It doesn't matter how big of a company you are, if your embed is too high in the page and it doesn't look like you have enough copy, they will not include the story, period, end of story. So let's real quick talk about images and video. Captions and cut lines need to be, and cut line is, I think, is a newspaper term for title attribute, need to be relevant to the story that you're writing about. So if you use a stock image that has an old caption attached to it, you have to make sure that you take that old caption out and update it for the story that you're writing about, especially if that image is in the hero position or if it's in between the headline and the story. Because what happens is dates in that, dates especially will screw things up. There was, let's see, we had an article at the LA Times where Katy Perry, I think it was, did a concert at the Hollywood Bowl for her birthday, and she was going to donate the funds to a charity. To illustrate the article, they used a photo of a concert that Katy Perry did at the Hollywood Bowl 6 months prior, because obviously the next concert hadn't happened yet, so they didn't have a picture, but they left the caption in that identified that picture as being from the concert that she did in September of the year prior. The problem was, because that image was so high in the article, the first date that Google encountered was September of the year prior, which made them think it was an old story, and stories that are older than 48 hours aren't included in Google News. So that story was never included in Google News because Google thought it was from September of the year prior, even though that image was just there to look nice. So making sure that you've updated the captions and the alt text and the meta title, anything associated with that image, to either strip out dates or make sure that the explanation for that image matches your current story, will prevent confusing Google. Because the bots don't see things like people do. These are both labeled kitten, so Google thinks these are both kittens. Google thinks these are both kittens because that's a puppy that someone named Kitten, and the only thing it had in the surrounding context was kitten, rather than saying something specific like boxer puppy named Kitten, or Blue Point Siamese kitten. If you're specific enough, short is great, but you have to have enough words so that it's very clear what you're writing about, because there's words that mean a lot of different things. So be clear, because the robots aren't super smart. When you're doing video, adding transcripts, adding tags, adding descriptions, adding content around the video itself on the page is going to help. It's going to help Google associate that particular video with that story, which can be helpful in jumping you up in the carousel, because people like pictures, but they like moving pictures more than they like pictures. When you're doing social, search is a part of all social media platforms. So remembering that you need to use your keywords in your social posts, especially when you're linking them over to your news articles or to your website, is very important. The social platforms are sending signals to the search engines. The value of those signals, sometimes it's higher, sometimes it's lower, but the velocity of your retweets and your shares does contribute to how well you perform in Google News. So Google News is monitoring how much people are sharing your news, making sure that your stories are shared with the keywords that you want to be found under, or with the headline exactly, is going to help you perform better in news search. Facebook is a valuable source of search engine rankings, even though it's gotten, again, it's diminished over the years, but you still have to make sure that you're using your keywords. We had a social team at one of the newspapers that I won't shame right now, but they had a tendency to share stories, and rather than use the headline of the story, they would just say, "This is cool," and then they'd have the link. This is cool doesn't tell anybody anything. You have to use the words that you want to be found for. When you use the words, that doesn't just mean adding hashtags to the end, because people don't necessarily monitor for hashtags, they monitor for keywords. So making sure that the keywords are in, even if they're not hashtags, is 100% more important than making sure that you have the right hashtags. The reason that we want to make sure that we're performing well in social search isn't just for increasing our search visibility, but it's for increasing our reach within those social platforms. If your goal is just to sing to the choir, which is, you're only talking to the people that are already following you, you don't obviously need to be as careful or concerned about the keywords that you're using. But the goal should be to cast a wider net. We're trying to amplify and reach people that we weren't reaching before, to get them to follow us so that we have a broader audience. If the goal is to reach a broader audience, you do need to make sure that you're using those keywords that those people who might not otherwise be following you will be watching for. So again, this is cool, not a good post. Detailed posts using the good keywords, that's the way to really take advantage of social search. So I know that was a lot of information. That was the end. I think we should have plenty of time for questions, and I need to figure out how to stop sharing.
Okay, thank you so much. It's so much information at the same time. It's very valuable, I guess, for us. So anybody would like to ask, Carolyn can just drop the message in the chat box, or you can just raise your hand and then interact directly. Anybody?
Teman-teman yang pada mau nanya silahkan ke chat ya. Ayo.
So if you are not very confident with the English, I can help you to translate it.
Silakan tanya-tanya.
Right there.
I can share my deck later, and maybe we can translate it if that would be helpful.
Sure. Ada yang bertanya kah? Oh, Win? Oh, bukan. So, okay. So this is the question from Reiki. Wait. So actually, the most important is when we creating articles, is it for Google or the readers? Exactly.
I think that's a balance. It's really for both. If you're creating the article in a way that the reader will appreciate, but Google doesn't understand, the number of readers you will reach is smaller. So if the goal is to reach more readers, maybe people who don't who aren't already following you, writing for both, just to make sure that Google understands what and correctly categorizes what you've written about is important. I think the reader is always, benefiting the reader is always the first thing you should do, but there are ways to take both into consideration. If you write to the exclusion of Google, you will be limiting the number of readers that you have.
Oke, so Regi, penulisannya harus balance ya untuk Google dan juga pembaca. Ada follow up question mungkin dari Regi atau dari yang lain?
Oke, thanks Mbak Cecil dan Carolyn.
Oke, thank you. Anything, anybody? Oh, okay. Lydia, please.
Okay, thank you for the opportunity. Okay, thank you, Carolyn, for sharing this very good explanation. I want to ask something, yeah. So you also explained about the social media, right? And you put some key points about Facebook and Twitter. But in Indonesia, yeah, actually a lot of young people active in Instagram. So I want to ask, is for Instagram also okay? And you have any key points for Instagram? Maybe on Reels, you should put more text or anything else? And also I want to ask another question, yeah, maybe about ads. So we know that some people also put ads, yeah, in Google, in the social media. Is that very helpful? Because I also try to add some keywords in the Google and then in the Facebook, yeah, but it's very hard, yeah, because we should know our target and we should put some budget. Maybe you have many some tips and tricks about it. Thank you.
Okay, so for the ads, I know that adding keywords to the ads will not help them show up in search because the ads are a different ecosystem and they're injected based on user profile rather than based on the search algorithm. So they're not, even though they appear in the search results, the pool that these search results are pulling from, they're separate. So the search results are the search results, the ads are the ads. We'll just say Google for the sake of simplicity. Google knows who you are. So they're going to show you your search results, and then they're going to pick ads based on you, not based on your search query, if that makes sense. So adding keywords to your ads isn't going to necessarily help. And it's certainly not going to help with news. Universal search might be a different story a little bit, but still the ads are the ads, and the search pool is not, they're not mixed, they're not commingled. Regarding Instagram, so text, I don't know about the Reels, I'm going to be honest. As far as news appearance goes, I don't believe that the Reels affect Google News appearance. But Instagram's internal search is very similar to other search platforms where they're looking for keywords in the text. So if you have an Instagram post and you want it to show up for crowns and tiaras, you need to have crowns and tiaras in the text somewhere on that page. So it's the nice thing about social media platforms is that their search algorithms are much more simple than what Google uses. So it really are the words in the text. It doesn't necessarily matter what the image is. If the words are in the text and you've got a link there, then you're going to have a much better shot at reaching people who are looking for the thing that you're looking for. But the ads, I don't think necessarily the ads are going to help with your organic search appearance. They'll help drive traffic to your site, but they're not going to necessarily affect your search appearance.
Okay, so Lydia, is it Do you have any follow-up questions?
Okay, that's enough. Thank you, Carolyn.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
So there is a question from Anggrani. Do you want me to read it, or you want to read it by yourself? I can read it for you. So for Indonesian context, she's been observing that some of online medias are doing this kind of multi-pages for only one articles. So what do you think about this? And could this harm the user experience because they are being forced to click the next page?
You know what? A lot of people, it's not just in Indonesia. A lot of outlets are doing that because it increases their page views and it increases ad impressions. So they're doing it to make more money because it's increasing ad impressions. If you have a long enough story, you can get away with this because as long as you meet that, as long as you have enough content for Google to accurately categorize and understand your story before you hit the next page, then that won't necessarily hurt your appearance in Google News or in the news search. But as a reader, I get very irritated by having, depending on how many times I have to click next page. So from the user experience, I would definitely say that's not my idea of a good user experience. But I also know that companies need to make money, and the revenue that you get from the CPM advertising, which is the strictly eyeballs, not necessarily, you're not getting paid on any actions, that revenue is diminishing. So to compensate for the diminishing revenue, they have to get more page views, and they're just trying to make money. So I do understand why they have to do it, because I too like to make money, but as a reader, it is, I personally think it damages the user experience, but you got to pay the bills.
True. So Anggreni, is there any follow-up question?
No, that's enough. Well noted. Thank you, Caroline. It answered all of the concern that I've asked on the question. Thank you.
Okay. So there's the raise hand from Denny. Denny, you can unmute.
So does aggregate news still work?
Thank you for the meeting. Sorry, Badan. Okay.
Oh, go ahead.
Recently, I saw this discussion about AI-generated art and surfacing online. Also, this AI-generated SEO content as well, which they performing very well. So my question is, what is your take on AI being able to rank on the top of SERP?
So I actually did a presentation at the News and Editorial Search Summit earlier this month, last month, about AI-generated content. So purely AI, it's difficult for news, especially like breaking news, to do AI-generated content because news is new. To do good AI content, you need to have inputs that change so that you've got data points to pull from so that you can assemble a logical, useful story. In the sports world, we use automated content to make like game previews. And game previews work really well because we have hundreds of data points to pull from. It's always two different teams, and each team has hundreds of different stats that we track. So we can take all of those stats and assemble them in a formulaic manner that will still be different and unique each time. Those kinds of stories can perform in search because they have to be unique, they have to be useful. When you start getting into just respinning existing information, I think there's diminishing returns on that. If you're not adding any new information or new value for the reader, that trick is only going to work so many times before it stops working, if that makes sense. The gist of my presentation at the News and Editorial Summit was that AI-generated news content is good for filler content, but it's never going to win a Pulitzer Prize. It's not going to replace real writers. So if you have real writers focusing on your really high quality content and then use the AI content to fill in the gaps and just increase the amount of content that you have overall, not expecting that AI content to do really well in search. It might show up, but I don't know that it's never going to be amazing. You still need your real writers to be amazing. So is it worth it? It depends on how much you're paying for it. If it's free, then yeah, sure, it's worth it. If you're paying a lot of money for it though, you could probably hire someone to write, to basically do what the AI is doing, but pay less money for it. So there's a business case to be examined as to whether or not it's a good idea.
Okay. Any follow-up question, Danny?
Okay, so we should not be afraid with the AI generated content then.
I'd try it. You know, if it's not too expensive and you're not relying on that to be your only content, I don't see a problem with giving it a try.
Okay.
Worst case scenario is it doesn't get a lot of traffic.
Okay.
Okay.
It's not going to hurt what you have though, if that's the question.
But
So the risk, the pain, there's no risk of pain. There's possible benefit, there's not a lot of risk of pain.
Okay. Denny, ada? Okay. Okay, next question coming from Muhammad. So regarding news, does aggregate news still works? He is curious, what do you think about it?
I don't know that you could have a website that is only aggregating news. So there are situations where people that are reprinting news stories from the original source can do better than the original source.
Mm-hmm.
So this was actually a problem that we encountered at some of the big companies that I've worked for. And the reason we had this problem was that there's so much going on around the story that it made it difficult for Google to get to the story. So when these other companies would steal our content, they would do better than we were doing because they had simpler websites where it was easier to get to the content. Is it ever okay to steal people's articles? I'm going to officially say no, that's bad. Don't do that. It's not nice. But where you can leverage the fact that these big companies don't have a necessarily search, it's not the friendliest search environment. If you're friendlier to Google than the big company is, there is a high probability that you will be able to hijack some of that traffic. Not long-term, because once it's out of the news cycle and Google has a more opportunity to process that, they're still going to ultimately give credit where the original source is. But if you're looking to hijack that short-term first 48-hour news burst, it can be done. I wouldn't make that my business model long-term, because I don't think it's going to be a long-term good idea. Short-term, that's up to you and your morals, but long-term, I'm not sure I would, I'd put all my eggs in that basket.
Okay, so any question from Muhammad, maybe? Any follow-up question? No? Okay, anybody else? We still have some time. And okay, Nata.
Yep, thank you. So my question is, when it comes to news SEO, we know there are many authors, and they usually write many topics like maybe finance and maybe so foods and beverage. And how is it like the impact for their EAT in their performance? Yeah, that's my question. You get it?
I got kind of lost in the middle because I think the my microphone is, or my speaker's not super clear. So
Yeah.
could you
When it comes in news SEO, right? News, we have many authors, many writer, and they write many topics. Yeah, maybe sometimes finance, sometimes maybe automotive. How big the impact for their EAP expertise and authorities? Is it really have a big impact for their performance?
So I think to be truly expert, they would need to have some kind of background in, you'd want to tie their background and either their education or their experience to the topic that they're writing about. It doesn't mean they can't write about a lot of topics, but it does mean that there is usually one topic that Google will associate them with more. So let's say you have a writer and they have a degree in finance, but they also like to write about cupcakes. Because their LinkedIn profile and their CV that's online and all of the documents that authenticate them as being qualified about a given topic are going to point at finance, it's probable that their expertise is going to be considered by Google to be finance rather than cupcakes, even though they really like to write about cupcakes and they're really into it. Google is still going to probably look at either what's in their LinkedIn profile or it's more about what their credentials are and less about the quantity that they write about. Over time, over a long period of time, that can change. Like if you have a degree in finance, but you only ever write about food, after a while, the weight of the food articles will tip the scales in the balance of the cupcakes. But without a lifetime of cupcake articles, Google is going to say your degree is in finance, so we think that you're an expert in finance. So they can still write about it, and it doesn't mean that the EAT is bad. There's a difference between not being not the best expert in cupcakes, but still being an expert in something, and not being an expert at all. So the longer they write about things and the more they write and making sure that Google understands that they're a real person, all of this will build towards a high EAT score.
Oh, I see. So the best practice for maybe if you have a news at LA and you search for the writer, you will search like for the writer have a big background for finance, will write about finance, and maybe automotive, and will write about automotive. So they didn't.
If you wanted to, if the writer really wanted to write about something very different from their field of expertise, adding that second field of expertise and having some kind of, like adding a mention to it. So like on their LinkedIn, I have a degree in finance from this school, but I also got a certificate in baking cupcakes, and I love to bake cupcakes in my spare time. Like, just making sure that both of those things are mentioned in as many places as you can to authenticate them as being also expert in that, I think will help. But again, it's the more you write about it and the more consistent you are in your topics, the more evidence Google will have that you are an expert in that field.
Okay, thank you. Maybe one question again, Carolyn. My friend have a question. It's about backlinking. How important is backlinking for news SEO?
No.
No?
I already mentioned that he cannot ask about
no,
sorry.
no
Sorry.
problem, but what your
What do you think
What
about
do you think about the backlink?
Yeah, my
news?
friend name is Adam. Yeah, he's a good
Adam
friend,
and
So in
What do
the
I think
chat
about web
box,
backlinks?
yes, so in the chat box, they were talking about how about a backlink for news, because I don't know, in Indonesia, it's still quite a practice that we put backlink to put the rank higher. So what do you think about it?
Adding links in the news to help people, or getting backlinks to your news stories to help your news stories?
It's adding backlink to your news stories to help the news stories.
It helps. Every backlink helps, period. The problem with backlinks help more with your universal search results and less with the news search results, because the news search results are really only good for about 48 hours, 48 to 72 hours. Unless there are a ton of backlinks to that news story immediately, like instantaneously, it's not going to make a huge difference. Sometimes someone will write a story and everyone else writes a story about that story and references that story. So that story will get credited as highly cited, which means it's a source for all of these other articles. That can be helpful, but in general, what you're doing with all of those backlinks is you're building authority for your domain in general, which will lift everything. So it's still a good idea. I mean, backlinks are still a good idea.
Kasih tahu backlink apa? Di sana mah backlink bagus.
Nata just
BBM.
oh, no. Okay. Is there any question again, Nata?
Thank you very much. Everything is already answered. Thank you, Carolyn.
Okay. So for Juan, would you like to be on mic? Mana nih? Juan.
Oh, he says
I'm
he's
good.
Bacain aja.
Okay. So from Juan, he have a question about sitemap. Does changing a regular sitemap into new sitemap has to do with the chances of the article or the contents to be appeared in news search?
Okay, so to be in news search, the sitemap is not mandatory, but a news-specific sitemap is highly recommended. And a news-specific sitemap is different than a regular sitemap because the rules for what you include and do not include in a news sitemap are a lot different than a regular XML sitemap. For the news sitemap, you can only include content that is less than 48 hours old. The second it's older than 48 hours, it has to cycle out. All of the news sites I work on, every single one, from the smallest site to ESPN's domestic site, which gets 60 million visitors a day, they all have news sitemaps, and they are all separate from the regular sitemaps, and they are updated constantly. So I would not run a news site and not have a news sitemap for that site.
Okay. Is there any follow-up question, Juan?
I do.
Oh, okay, go on.
So, which means that we need to make some kind of dynamic sitemap, right? Which means
Yeah,
that,
are you running WordPress?
not only WordPress, multiple CMS, but mostly on WordPress.
So on WordPress, there are several plugins that will
Right.
do news sitemaps for you. Yoast is a very good one. Yoast is, I think, probably the most detailed that I've seen because they also include several new options for your schema. Because there's news article schema, but now there's different kinds of news articles, opinion pieces, review pieces, analysis pieces. It's very detailed. I mean, if I had to choose, I would go with the Yoast news upgrade for my WordPress sites. I don't know if there are similar plugins for other content management systems, but for WordPress, it shouldn't be terribly difficult to get a good news sitemap generator dropped in quickly.
Right. So what if the website is built under code manually, which means that we need to craft the sitemaps, new sitemap manually as well. Does it still apply the same treatment as Yoast plugin, or there's some kind of different kind of treatment where
You would probably have to write some kind of program that would automatically update and generate that news content. The way you would do that would really depend on how it would have so many variables. I couldn't answer that question in this setting, but generating, depending on how much content you write every day, it's important to get that news sitemap updated immediately when the content goes out. And it could very easily be too much work for a person to do all day long.
Right.
So finding a way to automate that would be ideal.
Last follow-up question is regarding about the schema, about the news schema. Does it really necessary to put news schema for a news sitemap, for a news website, or let's say sitemap is just as is enough for the website itself?
I've found that the news schema helps tremendously. And I've also found that using the JSON LD schema rather than in the body is exceptionally helpful, because what happens with the JSON LD, you might be familiar, I don't know how familiar everyone else is, the JSON LD lives in the head of the document. Sure. And when a server comes by and requests a document, the first thing your server is going to shove at the requester is the content that's in the head. So what happens is when the Google News crawler comes by, it doesn't have to wait for your article to render, because you've already shoved all the important information at it in that head request. So the JSON LD is a huge benefit, especially if you have a site that maybe has a lot of JavaScript or a slow first time to first interactive or largest contentful paint. So if your core web vitals aren't awesome, that JSON LD is going to mitigate a lot of the damage that your core web vitals are causing.
Right. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Juan. So another question for Felicia. I think maybe it's the last one. So how important to show the writer or editor name in to the SEO in web news articles?
It's very important to have a byline. So the byline is part of what helps the robot understand that what it's looking at is a news article. Because again, I think we talked about it earlier, the robot had to be trained how to identify the difference between a regular web page and a news article somehow. So how do we teach it to look for what a news article is? Well, a news article usually has a byline, and the byline includes who wrote it and the date and maybe the location of the news desk. So making the article look like it would look if it were in a newspaper will help the machines understand that it's found a news article rather than just a regular web page. So just for purposes of identification, it helps set the stage. It helps the computer understand what it's looking at.
Okay. Any follow-up question, Felicia?
Okay, Cecilia, can you hear me?
Yes, I do.
Okay, Carolyn, thank you for answering my question. So, because in the other hand, shows other name in web news article is quite risky for journalists, especially when the topic is very sensitive. So, so it means that, is it okay others name just shows as initial in SEO in media?
So what I would do, like for automated articles and articles where we don't necessarily have a single person that worked on it, we'll use the byline staff reports or wire reports to indicate that it was either not someone that is normally a writer or it was just printed off of the wire, but we still have the byline. So I think as long as you still have a byline and something there, obviously, if you don't name the writer, that content won't ultimately be attributed to that writer's EAT score. So it's not going to help the writer develop his or her body of work. But as long as you have a byline there with something there, that's perfectly good. Because really the computer that's
Sorry, Carolyn.
sorry. So the computer that's trying to tell the difference between a regular web page and a news article is just looking for the presence of a byline. It doesn't really care what's written there. So if you need to protect the identity of the writer, you could just use a generic account or a generic name like staff reports. And that should be fine, or newsroom reports, or contributed reports, something like that. But as long as the byline looks the same in terms of its structure, the actual name of the reporter isn't going to matter that much.
Really matter. Okay. Thank you.
So I think that's all for tonight. We're already passing almost midnight in Indonesia. It's okay.
Thank you for staying up.
We are so happy about it. So anybody who would like to open your mic and say thank you to Carolyn, please go ahead.
Thank you, Carolyn.
Thank you, Caroline.
Thank you, Caroline.
Carolyn.
Thank you guys for staying up.
Yes, and
Yes, Carolyn.
before you left, please, we would like to make some documentation. Mas Erwin, can you choose a screenshot? Anybody who would like to be on the picture and documentation, please open your camera and say cheese.
Please.
Cheese.
Wik, minta Wik, Wik. Tolong Wik.
Oh, Wi, tolong Wi. Sabar ya, ditunggu satu. Udah siap, Wiwi? Oke.
Udah.
1, 2, 3. Thank you. Udah semua, Wi? Belum?
1, 2.
Oke.
Ini ada 3 page ya.
Oke. 3 page. So, one more time.
1, 2. The last one, please.
The last one.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you also. Thank you, Carolyn, for tonight. It was such a pleasure to have you in our community, and I hope you have a good time sharing with us.
Masuk ke Telegram.
Okay, so we have a community, and anybody who would like to join us, we would like to share any updates about SEO. So please join the Telegram. You will find any information there, and also free webinar. Oh, why do I speak in English? Jadi yang mau join bisa langsung ke chat box ya. Kita masih ada beberapa webinar lagi sampai akhir tahun ini dan juga tahun depan. Jadi informasinya akan di-share di Telegram. Begitu. Terima kasih semuanya. So maybe last word from you, Carolyn. Anything?
Oh, I don't know. We've said so much already. I appreciate you all staying up so late to talk with me, and thank you so much for inviting me.
Do you mind if we invite you again, maybe somewhere in next year?
Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you so much. We can end the recording, Mas Erwin.